So hello everybody, I'm Craig Cummings. I have some over-glorified titles here. I'm very fortunate also to be a part of Translation Commons and be working on adding languages to computers and mobile devices. So you may know Unicode, and I need to talk a little about Unicode first here. You may know Unicode for emoji. We're hoping that you know Unicode for the many writing systems and characters, all of them for the world that we support. Here's actually a poster of a number of those that are supported already in blue. We have some work still to do, as you can see from those writing systems in red there. But maybe you knew Unicode for other pieces, like when you turn on your device here. It turns out that every piece of text on pretty much every modern device. So when you turn your phone on, what you're looking at right now in the presentation that I'm giving, every piece of text is actually a Unicode piece of text. The date and time there are actually produced by Unicode as well. That little percent for your battery and how much charge you have left, that's actually a Unicode format. So there's a lot of pieces of Unicode going on here to provide better international support for languages on computers and mobile devices everywhere. And so as part of Translation Commons, and we've sort of been running a series of talks here, we've been talking about zero to digital and the 4 parts of zero to digital in particular. So Dr. Deborah Anderson talked about Unicode characters. We talked about fonts. Dr. Craig Cornelius talked about keyboards. So I'm going to talk today about that last piece, the Unicode CLDR, so the Common Locale Data Repository part of this, the data part that backs it all up. And the data part helps these, so here was Dr. Deborah Anderson, perhaps, and others talking about characters and how they get into Unicode and that kicking off the process of getting the support on the devices. And Dr. Craig Cornelius might have talked about, some of his recent work with making keyboards, and here's just one of those. And I would love to talk to you about CLDR more, but this is intentionally an eye chart. You're not supposed to be able to read this, and you wouldn't want to read this really. And we're revamping this right now on the Unicode CLDR website because it's not just hard to read, but it's hard to follow. These are the steps to get CLDR data for your language and to get it working on, to get it started working on computers and mobile devices. And it's intentionally hard to read because the steps are more complicated than and they're sort of meant for only those who might intimately know Unicode. So I'm going to try and explain that a bit better and put those steps into something that better resembles maybe not so technical English. So let's see how well I do that. So some of the first steps that are listed there's actually like 7 or so steps. And the first step is actually to figure out what you call your language. So that's an autonym, the language in the language name. So here it is for Osage. I believe that's Wajaje. And forgive me, my Osage is a bit rusty here. I'm not an Osage speaker. I've learned a few words here and there. The second step is to figure out what characters are representative for that language. And we call these in CLDR, Unicode CLDR, we call these exemplar characters. And then with a few more pieces of data, particularly around dates and times, remember turning on your phone, you see the dates and times there, and it's one of the first things you see. With a few other pieces of data here, and some of these are kind of interesting, does your language have plurals, for example? And how does that work? Is that 1 duck or 2 ducks? Or is it even more complicated than that? Or are there no plurals at all? And it varies by language. So you gather this data that was in that long document that was really hard to read there. You gather this data and you put it in a format that Unicode CLDR likes. And then more magical things happen. So once you get just this core data, these basic pieces of data, there thankfully is a better way to do this, and that is Unicode CLDR has an interface called the survey tool. So here is the survey tool running. It has a nice browser interface that you can look at here, and you can see here's actually. Let me see if I can zoom this in here. Let folks see a little better here. Let's try right there. So you can see the survey tool displaying the exemplar characters here for the Lakota language. And the Lakota language is a Native American language for the Sioux people, the Lakota people in the middle of the United States. And so you notice that they have a lot of characters, and they're not A, B, C, D anymore. There's all sorts of characters here. They are their script is a Latin-based script, though, and so if you're seeing some Latin characters here, you're seeing the right things. But and we'll talk a little more about how to figure out what those characters are. But I wanted to show you sort of the interface that basic set of data gets you to. So here is I had the fortune of working with the Hoopa people of Northern California, and they actually, I'm even more fortunate, they had a nice dictionary to look at, and the dictionary actually, if I can show you a better slide here, the dictionary had a nice chart of the alphabet, and you can see those characters here, really nicely laid out, along with some examples and some pronunciation, and so figuring out the exemplar characters for Hoopa is pretty easy, as it turns out. Other languages may not be as easy to figure out or to document or to gather those first steps of data. So, for example, we looked at the Blackfoot language earlier, and we saw that nice chart of the Blackfoot characters, but they don't have a dictionary, for example. You have to find another source that documents the characters, and then you can put them in a form that Unicode CLDR needs and get Blackfoot working. But we're not quite there yet because we don't actually have the Blackfoot characters are not yet in Unicode. But as it turns out, the Chickasaw characters are in Unicode. They actually use the Latin script as well. And so not only do you know what the letters are, but now there's an index part of the exemplar characters. So there's the main set of characters. There's an auxiliary set of characters that are like if the Chickasaw people were talking to the Choctaw people or to the Lakota people, would they have the characters that they need? Do they talk a lot? And would those be part of an auxiliary set to support the main characters of Chickasaw, for example? And then there's these index characters, and everybody's familiar with indices in books. You turn to the back, and there's an organized list of the characters and topics according to those characters. And here, if you turn to the back of the grammar book for Chickasaw, it actually this may be the dictionary. It has an organized set of the index characters for Chickasaw. And if you scroll down here, oops, sorry. If we go, I'm getting ahead of myself. Go back to Chickasaw. My mouse will behave well. Notice that it doesn't go ABC, it goes ABCH. So the order is a bit different, and different languages will have different indices, right? And we can document that, and we can get that data to Unicode CLDR, and we can start getting our language on computers and mobile devices. And then there's a few more pieces we need before we quite have that basic set of Unicode CLDR data. And these are pretty easy pieces as well to come up with sometimes. But if you think about them, they're at least easy to think about because they're familiar. These are the names of the months. These are the names of the days of the week. These are the things that would put together a date if you were to turn your phone on. And as you saw in one of the first slides there, we turned our phone on. You saw actually that slide. Why don't I go back to that slide so we can look at it again. There. On the left side, there's the date format for English. On the right side, this is actually the date format for Lakota. So that's a Lakota day name. That's a Lakota month name. And there's the Lakota day of the week there. Actually, it turns out that that day number doesn't change. They use Arabic numerals to signify numbers in there. But other languages of the world may or may not have Arabic numbers. They may have Arabic Indic numbers, or they may have Thai numbers, or they may have other numbers. There's other numbering systems of the world as well that support the language. So let's go back to our slide for putting together the CLDR data and some of these last pieces. And then again, more of those pieces around the dates and times, and then there's pieces for numbers, but those come later. There's other pieces of CLDR, and maybe I'll show you a demo here real quick in a bit, and we can talk more about that. But sometimes there aren't, this data is not as easy to collect as you might think, and some wordsmithing needs to go on. Some languages of the world may not have concepts for all of these things, and so as it turns out, for the Muskogee language, they didn't have a word for second. They had day, hour, minute, but they don't have a word for second. So do we invent a word? Do we not have a word in CLDR? What do you do for seconds? And that discussion is actually going on still with the people of the Muskogee Nation, and the Muskogee Nation is another one of these languages in the middle of the United States, a Native American language. And so there's sometimes in just putting this basic set of Unicode data together can be an interesting journey. But when you get a little further with that journey, and here we are again, we're looking at the survey tool, the Unicode CLDR survey tool here, that better interface, and we're looking actually at those month names now for Lakota. And here's the days of the week for Lakota. So, working with the Lakota language community and Unicode, we were able to gather a lot of good information about that language. We were able to put together that core set. We were able to get it into the survey tool, and then ultimately the data that you're seeing here in the survey tool is the data that gets picked up and built into the devices by Google, Microsoft, Apple, the list goes on. And so here is sort of what that might look like. Here's actually what success looks like on a device, and I should be careful about saying that success, and I'll explain in just a minute. But you can see at the top, this is actually the language picker on my Mac, and it has a number of indigenous languages here, starting with some Native American languages, Cherokee and Lakota. And you can, these with CLDR data, and the CLDR data getting picked up by the device makers, in this case, Apple. Apple put Cherokee, had enough data for Cherokee, and was able to put Cherokee on the computer. And they did this actually. Cherokee has been one of the Native American languages, one of the first, if not the first, Native American language on Apple computers, and one of the first of many indigenous languages. Now you see a number of indigenous languages here on Apple devices, which is great, but there's more. There's more work to do here. You also see Lakota is second in the list now, Inuktitut. But it also is kind of deceiving. So it turns out that actually Navajo and Guarani, the last two on the list here, don't have the Unicode CLDR data backing them. So you can change the language here, but when you turn on your device and look at that date and time, for example, or if you see other pieces, you're not going to see the Navajo language. You're not going to see the Guarani language if you set that. So there's more work to do for those languages. It normally getting data in CLDR actually helps the language appear in this language picker, in addition to doing a number of other pieces of rather subtle functionality, but things like dates and times and numbers and currencies. Actually, you can see some of the things it does here. This is all CLDR data. So here is what the Cherokee date would look like if you were to display it. And then it actually uses the same number formats and currencies as the United States, the rest of the United States. So that's not a great difference here, but depending on where you are in the world and what language that is, that might differ. But there's some work for other languages to get that CLDR data and provide more than just the facade that we see here for Navajo and Guarani, and to make them work as well, as richly as Cherokee. So it turns out that the Cherokee language here has a wealth of CLDR data that has been provided by the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation has been very active with Unicode from the very beginning, along with their activities working with the various device makers, making sure that the implementation for Cherokee was great as well. But they provided a wealth of information. So when Cherokee is chosen here, it's not a facade. It actually provides some great functionality to the device, and Cherokee works a whole lot better, and it enables Cherokee to go further with the language on the devices, so that it turns out that there are now Microsoft versions of Office in Cherokee, or parts of Office. I know of at least Word, and maybe Dr. Craig Cornelius will chime in because he works a lot with the Cherokee Nation and tell us all the other pieces. But suffice it to say that Cherokee, because of the start with Unicode data, because Cherokee worked with Unicode initially, went through step one of 0 to digital. So they got the characters in there. They got some fonts. They got a keyboard. They got the data working here, and now Cherokee works just really well on devices. And there's probably still more to go. I don't know that, if you set this to Cherokee, not all of my Mac will turn into Cherokee characters. So not every app or every piece on my screen turns into Cherokee characters. The localizations are not yet fully present, but certain pieces certainly work better in Cherokee than not, and part of that is because of the Unicode data piece. But really, I should let the Cherokee Nation tell their story themselves, and I link you to a YouTube at the end of this, and it's presented by one of the most active people they have working with the device makers, working with Unicode. This is Roy Boney. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation, and he has done a spectacular job of making sure that the Cherokee language works well in the digital context. And you should listen to him tell that story. It's a video well worth watching. Anyway, back to Unicode CLDR. So one of the first things you can do to get started and say, hey, I want my language to work better as well, and here's the data piece. You can file what CLDR calls a ticket. So we use a piece of software by Atlassian called Jira, and that Jira lets you write up a title for what you want to do, and that core data piece we actually called, you could just say, I want to add a locale for Guarani now. Actually, the Guarani locale has been added, but the data hasn't been populated. So you could actually come up with a title for your new ticket here in Jira that says, I want to add lots of data for Guarani. And then you just start populating the ticket with the data that you might have. And I've shown you now how to get some of that data. So you can say the Guarani language, the autonym for the Guarani language is actually Guarani. And then here are the exemplar characters. And I've got exemplar characters for the main characters, and I've got them for the auxiliary characters. And hey, I found a book with an index in the back, and here are the characters for Guarani, the index characters for Guarani. And you just go through the list of things you can add, day names, month names, some of those words I had in the slide, and we'll make a copy of the slides here available. and it's not a lot of data to just get started. And then you get to the survey tool. And in the survey tool, then you can start adding data yourself. We enable an account for you, and anyone that you might designate as a language authority, a language contributor, a data contributor, and you just start plugging in data and adding to the CLDR set. And that's what they did for Cherokee. That's what, as you can see, the Muskogee Nation here, and those folks are doing right now as part of this ticket. And this was a ticket that sort of started it all off. There was a gathering of the language and its pieces of data. It's now in the survey tool, and the Muskogee Nation, people of the Muskogee Nation, they are fortunate they have an entire education department and a language education department, and those people now have accounts on CLDR, and they're contributing data. And they're contributing it using the survey tool interface. So some links there about how to get started and what that looks like. And I run out of slides. So this is a pretty quick presentation, but I was hoping we'll have some good questions and conversations to go on here. But with that, why don't we take questions, and I'll come back to my slides as I might need.
Thank you, Craig. You packed a lot of stuff in half an hour. You did, and it is amazing all the good things that have happened with CLDR and how it facilitates, the communities to be able to use their mobiles, along with everything else, all the steps that need to be taken into, when we outline them in Zero to Digital. I would love to know more about a lot of these communities you talked about, because you have this good relationship with them, and they're all like case studies for the rest of us.
Well, we're fortunate. Actually, a number of folks in participating in Translation Commons has a number of these good relationships, has worked with these language communities, and it's a great opportunity that we have it. Some folks might be seeing the camera of Dr. Craig Cornelius. So Dr. Craig Cornelius had been working with the Cherokee Nation and some language communities in the state of Oklahoma in the middle of the United States. And he and the then chair, so I'm now the acting chair for the Unicode Technical Committee, but the then chair for the Unicode Technical Committee was Lisa Moore. And Lisa and Craig suggested, hey, Craig Cummings, when you're next time in Oklahoma, and as it turns out, I grew up in Oklahoma, and so I have friends and relatives still there. I grew up in Alaska. I haven't been to Alaska in a while, but I need to go because there's a number of indigenous communities there. But as it turns out, going back to Oklahoma, I stopped by the Osage Nation on my first trip, and then said, you know what? Actually, there's about 60, 70 language communities in Oklahoma. I have some more work to do here on my next trip. And so on my next trip, you saw that I stopped by the Muskogee Nation, and I stopped by the Chickasaw Nation, and I stopped and visited with a few other people, people from the Choctaw Nation, people from the Shawnee Nation, and the list goes on. And it's a very rich environment of language communities in one small area. And it's kind of nice to have that you can reach out to so many people and start this process. But Dr. Craig Cornelius and Dr. Deborah Anderson and others have been working in this space as well. Have lots of connections to lots of different communities. Not to mention you, Jeanette. You've been traveling a bit. You've been talking to a lot of folks. So we're fortunate to have this engagement. But we're just scratching. This is the tip of the iceberg, if you will, just scratching the surface here, because we've got a few tens of language communities, but we know there are thousands of language communities out there that we need to serve, and we need to get them to have that seat at the table of technology and for the devices to work as well in their language as it does for others.
And thankfully, with the decade, we'll have a good opportunity now. And the decade is starting, it's imminent. And since we're on the topic, I also want to say that the Global Action Plan is now available for consultations and comments. And I will be sharing it with everybody in this community group, obviously with the advisory board of the LDI for sure. Yes, and exactly, Craig, you want to, share your comment with everyone?
What could I tell you there?
No, Craig Cornelius made a comment.
There you go. Please.
It's very noisy here, so I don't think. Can you hear the background noise?
No, not too much.
Okay, well, thank you, Craig. This is great, and I work with CLDR, but there's always something new to learn about it. I wonder how you deal with communities that have multiple orthographies. There are different Lakota communities, for example, each of which learned and maintains its writing using different rules, different characters, different spelling systems. How does CLDR handle languages such as that?
That's a great question. So CLDR actually, and computers right now, have the capability of differentiating multiple orthographies. So for example, when I went to visit the Chickasaw Nation, it turns out they have 4 different orthographies. 2 are historical and no longer used, but 2 are still very much used. And it's even more interesting. The Chickasaw Nation says, we do not embrace one of the 2 modern orthographies more than the other. We use both, and both are correct. So we have to encode both. Now, as it turns out, one is actually used a little more than another, so we started with that first. CLDR has a mechanism, has a few mechanisms we can use to differentiate orthographies. There's a mechanism actually to differentiate by country and province or state and geographic location. But since Chickasaw is in Oklahoma and that state isn't changing, and both of those orthographies are in the same place, that really doesn't help differentiate those. You need some other mechanism. And so it turns out that there's a variant mechanism as part of a different standard, not the Unicode standard, but a different standard that the Unicode standard embraces, and that variant can be used and is used in only a couple different contexts right now to differentiate and not so much differentiate orthographies. But in discussion with CLDR folks, one of the better mechanisms is that variant to differentiate orthographies. Now, there is a little problem with that variant. The variant is supported on computers and mobile devices. So we can say, here's the Chickasaw orthography 1, and here's the Chickasaw orthography 2. We can tell the computers that differentiation right now, and the computers understand that differentiation, but the feature is not turned on in the devices. So we have some work on the devices as well to do to turn that on and make it work so that we can properly differentiate those languages. And I've run into many where it would be hard for me to say of the tens of languages that I've worked with so far, indigenous languages that I've worked with so far, maybe a quarter of them had multiple orthographies and wanted more than one to be represented. In other cases, they only had one, and we're fortunate only to have one because that's a little easier to get working than not. In other cases, they had several, but they had a guiding body that aligned on a single orthography. But for those that haven't, and for those that are interesting, kind of like the Chickasaw Nation and their language community, where there are multiple orthographies used, we're going to have to do, there's still some work to be done. That does not prevent us, though, right now from at least starting the process, gathering the data, getting it into CLDR, getting it ready to put on those devices, and then it's just a matter of reaching out to the device makers and say, hey, turn that feature on, please, so that multiple orthographies can be recognized and displayed. Who's next?
Julie.
Julie.
Hello, and thank you, Craig Cummings. I have a question about what the correct instruction is for. Let me just change this. To a language community who wants to start populating their information in CLDR, and so you said something about file a ticket. I think that's the correct wording, that they should file a ticket. So I clicked around, and let me share. Sorry, my mouse is not helping me here. I got to this page. I'll put it.
Does it say it's a 404 page not found error? So I should back up here. I showed everybody how it ought to work, and it used to work really well. I also shared that Unicode CLDR is revamping its website so that the hard to read instructions are going to be now easier to read. But in that process, not all of those pages are working yet. So if you have some trouble getting to these pages, give us a little more time. We're working on that. But that's not the problem you had, Julie. You were...
No. It was just that I couldn't. I was just trying to click and share in the chat thread right now the page that I went to. And the page so far, it looks okay. So it says CLDR change requests. So that is the starting place. That is the correct starting place for a language community, that we would send them to this page. Is that right?
Yes. Or you could send it to an advocate like me, and I could file a ticket. I could do a change request. At some point, though, I'm going to be overwhelmed by about 3,000, 4,000, 6,000 change requests for all the languages of the world. But go on.
Okay, so I'm just imagining, since this step is new for me, I feel like I'm a valuable resource to you because I've never used it, and so I can bump into whatever's confusing about it. It's not confusing yet from what you've said, but I just want to establish this is the right starting place.
This would be a great starting place, and typically you've got, the language community has some tech-savvy folks working with them that are at least tech-savvy enough they can go to a link on a website. They can create a new ticket here, create an account. It says you will need a Jira account. Create a new ticket, and actually I think the Jira account is now well enough enabled that if you have a Google account or an Apple account or a Facebook account or things like that, it'll say, hey, we're just going to log you in using that. You're logged into Jira now. Would you like to create a new ticket? And you click on the little create button, and you start creating a new ticket, and you start typing in that CLDR data, starting with the autonym and the exemplar characters and the dates and month, day names and month names, and you're practically done with the ticket. And then the CLDR folks are going to see that, and then start that process of getting that to the survey tool. If you have even more savvy tech people available to you or the language community, or that are part of the language community, even better, and if they know about GitHub, if they're good with code and programming and maybe XML, it turns out that the file format that backs the CLDR data is an XML file. So they could actually go even further and check that in using a piece of software called GitHub. They can check that file in, and there's a different set of instructions than you're looking at the instructions here for filing a ticket. There's also a set of instructions on how to be a more active contributor, and to go ahead and check in an XML file that has all this data in it. And then it's in the form that instantaneously, well, not instantaneously, but in a quicker manner, CLDR's survey tool can pick that up. And then with survey tool, there's that much better interface that anybody, tech savvy or not, can start contributing with that nice interface. All they have to do is type words, right? I'm going to click on the day name for Monday in Lakota. I don't like that translation, or I'm going to put a new translation in there. I type that translation in Lakota. Done. I go to the next piece of data.
Thank you. So opening the JIRA account, am I
Mhm.
correct that that is the, let's say, the language advocates account that they need, that they use for their identity or their participation in the CLDR? Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And for kicking off the process of saying, at least, I want my language represented. And by the way, I happen to know that some of that data that is for my language that will start this process, and I'm going to put that in the ticket as well, and done. But it doesn't even have to start out with the data. It could just say, I want this new language represented because I don't see it right now.
Thank you very much.
Sue Ellen?
I have a question about the data. How much data do you need to consider it to be effective? And to what extent can this resource be used? You say, is this resource available then to people who have collected it? Does it go out on GitHub? I chuckled when you called GitHub a software program. I think of it as an environment. Is it available then to people who want to use this data? Right now I'm working on a standard for term extraction, and we're talking about creating corpora. And that would be is this a place where people can start to archive and create a corpus, or do they need to do that independently on their own if they want to create a word extraction or term extraction environment?
So,
sorry, it's not an easy question.
There's a number of questions there. Let me see if I've got a couple of them right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what is that? We know the minimum data to start the survey tool, but what is the minimum data that really is going to be ideal for the language, or better yet,
right.
I think what you're after is, what's that minimum data that's going to get me on the devices? Let me answer that first. And then your second question, I think, was about what if we want to contribute more data or other pieces of data and produce a corpora for a certain particular kind of data. And I'll come to that second there, Sue Ellen. So first there's the minimum pieces of data, as you saw, that I just presented about, are 50, 60 pieces, 60 translations, give or take, or 60 pieces of data, because characters aren't really translations, right? But there are translations for the day names and month names, and there's about 16 pieces of data that start this. That's that minimal set for CLDR, and it starts that survey tool working, where then you can, lots of people now have a better interface to enter more data. And the more data, there's actually, let me show my screen here. Let's take a look at the survey tool. I have it displaying right now, and let's hope it behaves as well as I'm wanting it to.
And is this data public immediately?
Yeah, well, that's part of my question. Can people go back and access and use it for? And I actually formulated another part of my question, but I'll hold on to that.
Okay, let's talk about who can view and what's viewable in just a moment. Let me get you to the survey tool, though. I'm having trouble sharing my screen, but let's just do it right here. Come on, share. There we go. And if we go to, can everybody see my screen now? And there's the survey tool. And let's go to Lakota here. Oh, one, I need to spell, and two, I need to take my caps lock off. All right, so we click on Lakota. And now you can see all the sorts of kinds of data that are actually in CLDR. But better yet, you can see there's this thing called coverage at the top. And there's different levels of coverage that CLDR has. So we're talking right now about that core piece that has just a few pieces of data here. And then maybe Basic has a few more than that. Basic has, I think, a couple hundred. And Basic, it takes more than that to really make your language work well. You need to get probably to the modern and comprehensive levels, and very honestly, that's a bigger step, because there's on the order of a couple thousand pieces of data for modern, and I think comprehensive has about 10,000 pieces of data. For example, Cherokee is at the comprehensive level, but there are only 5,000 pieces of data of the 10,000. So they're still not fully comprehensive, but they're really, really good, and it works marvelously well on computers. Getting to it, sometimes you'll see the vendors, and now it becomes a sort of a vendor choice. So it turns out that Inuktitut doesn't have, you saw it in the list, it doesn't have much more data in CLDR than BASIC right now, and it's working its way toward modern, and yet it made it onto computers. There's a different set here of what you saw for Cherokee, what you saw for Lakota. They actually are closer to the modern or comprehensive, and typically when languages have, more pieces of data and pieces that are pretty important to the functioning of the language well, for that language to function well on computers and mobile devices, that's that modern and comprehensive level. So the answer to your question, Sue Ellen, is somewhere between probably 1,000 pieces of data and not necessarily 10,000 pieces of data. And some of those are translations and some are not.
What does a piece of data look like? Is a piece of data
Let's take a look at that.
Like a term pair, or is it a piece of bytext? They're term pairs.
They are term pairs, and some are translations. So here's a translation of the word year in Lakota.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, but they're definitely term pairs, and not, because that's the other thing. Because I'm often working with documents, paired pieces of bytext. So I've got 3,000 words here, and in segments matched to translation. So it's not that kind of thing.
No.
Okay, because that needs to be clarified, because the one of the things that you might be wanting your people to do, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of collecting terminology. Well, you start out by translating documents and extracting terms from the documents, and then you get your term pairs. So I need to know what you mean by data.
And as you can see, the data varies. The data. There's actually a document called LDML that describes all the data that's in that magical little XML file that I told you backs up all the system. And it describes, what is a day name? What is an exemplar character? What are date formats here? So here is something that isn't a translation. This is how for your language community, how do people want to see their dates? What should those dates look like? When you turn your phone on, what does that look like? And what is that experience? And so the data varies in here. But there's a larger document, so it'll take me a bit to get to this, but I could probably link it. I'll link it in the chat. How's that sound? And it's called the LDML document, and it describes all of this, Sue Ellen. But it's not the easiest to read, so I would welcome questions about the LDML document and the data that you'd like to see represented, and see where the matchup might be or not. Rather than you wading through that document.
I'd like to see representatives. What is being represented? I think you've answered it. That they're often, now, when you do these matched pairs, are they always just? I'm right in the middle of a big project that is right in the middle of this kind of thing. Do you do things like collocations and co-occurrences in addition to just Monday is this in the other language?
Mm-hmm.
Or submit a document is XYZ in the other language.
Mm-hmm.
Where you have a collocation that involves in terminology work, we look at both, and we start out frequently. I'm working on a project right now that involves automatic term extraction. And our best bet is to start with bytext. We don't always have bytext. By bytext, I mean text that is a straightforward translation of B and has been vetted. And we can use that to start extracting terms. And what I'm trying to zero in on is what actually gets stored here, and it looks like it's the terms.
It is the terms, but it's a very finite set of terms.
Okay.
That deal with
or anything like that. It's just the terms that you need for certain purposes.
It's not a generic repository.
Okay,
it's not a key value store that you could say.
That's what I wanted
I have
to find
this English and this translation in the language, and I just want to put that somewhere. It unfortunately is not that.
So many technical questions. Is there any natural link between this and, say, I'm building a bigger store? I'm building collecting an archive of bytext. And is there some sort of link, like in and I'm going to use another technical term, like an XML serialization or something like that I could use to feed my system with your information?
That is a good question, Sue Ellen, and I'm going to have to actually put that to the folks with the committee. There certainly are there's a number of pieces in this system that could be leveraged to do some of the work that you're doing, but how to do that, and if you were to go to that magic GitHub store that I talked about, it actually has as open source, the whole survey tool is open source, and CLDR is open source, and the tools around it are open source.
Right.
I don't know how much of the survey tool is open source, but a lot of the tools are open source, and there might be some tools in there that you could leverage and might help you. But I don't know which those are, and we'd need to talk to some of the CLDR folks who know those tools better than I do. But I can put you in touch.
Yeah. I'm sorry to ask such
good questions.
But we're working in very big industrial environments, so it's not indigenous languages. But ideally, we would be wanting to leverage some of the technology that we've developed for the languages that we work with to help people collect, because one of the goals would be to collect the literature, if you will, of your people, which is mostly oral, and create corpora of these oral traditions and then be able to extract terms from those.
So one of the things I think I'd rather do here is there are archivists, and Sue Ellen, we've spoken within Translation Commons about archiving data and collecting this data, archiving this data. There are a number of people who specialize in this. I am not one of them. And as you can see, CLDR is a very specialized archive here, with only certain select pieces of information that are important to that. And so that more specific solution may not apply to something more generic or specialized to archival than to, say, just getting a language working on a computer. And so maybe there's some things that could be leveraged, and maybe what I think would be the better thing is for us to take this offline and talk to some of the archivists, and I can put you in touch at least with the folks at the University of Oklahoma and some other specialists I know. And then there's a number of folks we've talked about and talked to that are specialists in archival, and they might have a better solution. What really might be the solution is not to leverage CLDR, but CLTR to leverage the archives and to take the pieces of what's gathered that are important to get a language working on computers, and then we're further along in the process.
I guess and I'll quit talking here. I'll just say this last thing. I'm thinking ahead in terms of, we've talked about machine translation. And of course, machine translation is always going to be sketchy at moments, but the bigger your your document archives and in your bigger your corpus, the more luck you're going to have with your machine translation. And so all these things go hand in hand. Now I'll just shut up. I've talked too much.
CLDR doesn't have a big enough corpus to do that kind of thing, I don't think. But maybe adding that to a different corpus, you might help it do some things better and, help the machines learn about that to do machine translation or other things better.
Craig, we have a question
yes, please.
In the chat from Rogers Ede. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name very well. Maybe you want to unmute yourself and give us some more information?
Another great question about timing. So, from the time, Unicode CLDR has 2 releases each and every year. One of those releases in the spring and one in the fall. The one in the spring typically is the better timing for new languages to be added, but it can happen in either release. That said, so there's a 6-month window between filing any ticket and at least a 6-month window between filing any ticket and getting that working in CLDR, and then getting a language well enough populated with data that it could go into something that could go onto computers. So 6 months would be the minimum. On average, it takes longer than that. And part of it is, if you've got to do a couple thousand pieces of data, and you need, the right translators, the right knowledgeable people in the community to figure out those translations or those pieces of data, like what does my community want to look at in terms of a date formatter? Okay, we've got the day names and we've got the month names, but we're struggling with this other part of data. And so it typically takes more time. Now, that said, one community recently, and a part of me doesn't like using this as an example, and a part of me is like, this is the best example we've ever had. And it was the Nigerian Pidgin language community. They came in and they had practically 10,000 pieces of data right then and there, and they were in a Word format. So we converted the Word format into something that CLDR could use, as much of that as we could, and then they did a whole lot of manual work with the survey tool as a better interface to do that work, but they did a lot of input. And in 6 months, they had their language in CLDR and enough data for it to be taken up on computers. And hopefully we'll be seeing that finished up, I think, very recently, and hopefully we'll start to see Nigerian Pidgin appear on our computers and mobile devices. But on the whole, it typically takes more than 6 months. But within that 6 months, you can start, at least you can kick off the survey tool, regardless of what time of the year it is. You can get that basic, 50, 60 pieces of data in there real quick, and get survey tool up and running and start going to town on more input. So that can happen pretty quickly.
And does this answer your question?
If not, Rogers, please enter. Let me know what other questions you might have, and I'll take some other questions in the meantime.
Sue Ellen is next.
Sue Ellen.
I accidentally hit the wrong button. I was just going to write a note. It doesn't surprise me that you came up with a wealth of information for Nigerian Pidgin, because some of you probably know this already. Nigeria is a huge country with something like 400 language varieties, and Nigerian Pidgin is the language that everybody communicates in. And of course, there's huge variation in. I have close friends who are experts in Nigerian Pidgin. You wonder why I'm speaking on this topic. But it doesn't surprise me that it's virtually, this is the language of mutual communication. So I'm delighted to see that come out. It almost deserves to be. It's never been recognized as the official language, but for all intents and purposes, it is.
It sets the bar very high. I don't know that all language, and I can tell you right now, not all language communities can move that fast. And, so there may be different problems with different language communities on trying to gather that data and trying to use the system. For example, that Muskogee Nation that I'm working with, they are having problems even accessing the network. So they have some internal network internet problems that are plaguing them to even get to the system to do a lot of that work. So we go back and forth with Word documents on here's the next set of pieces of data we'd love to have in CLDR and would get your language further, and that could happen as well. But where and some communities around the world, some language communities are going to be unfortunate. They're going to have blockers that are bigger than the data in technology that may hinder them getting their language where they want it to be. But we can work around that too. And the Nigerian pidgin folks just happen to have it all working really well, and boom, they get their language done. And sometimes it'll work that way.
We have Rogers and Julie raising their hand at the same time. Since we started with the subject of Rogers, let's go with him.
Rogers from Nigeria.
Hi, Rogers. Great question so far. What's your next question?
Hear me now.
I think we can hear you.
No.
Yeah, can you hear us?
Okay. Yes, I'm Rogers from Nigeria. I'm the one that asked about the window, the time span it will take for a ticket to get processed for the language to enter into CLDR. I filed a ticket some time back, but until the survey tool closed, the ticket was not processed and the language didn't enter into the CLDR. And I also know that there are some things I couldn't do on the survey tool. When I want to log into the survey tool, it will not open for me to enter the details. And I couldn't locate where the XML file is so I could fill in the data. So I had to pass through someone that has already been there. So the ticket was assigned to somebody. So I want to know, does it have to always be that way, or anyone that has account in the survey tool can have access to those data and then enter it by himself, or does it have to pass through someone who has already been there?
So a number of questions. So Rogers, tell me again the name of the language. Actually, if you could type it into the chat. Sorry, you weren't coming through the best on, at least I couldn't hear you as well as I would have liked. So if you've got the ticket number and the language, the name of the language that you're working on, I can help you follow it up. I will have to say that the resources at CLDR are a bit limited. And so the number of people working on it is not all that we'd like to see to scale to things, but we should have been able to get to your language. That said, if you've got that ticket number, that would help a lot, and I can help with the follow-up there. And then the survey tool should work for everyone who has an internet connection. I would have liked to have actually, is your language, did you provide that basic set of data already? Is your language in the survey tool? Did you see it there?
Well, it's not in the survey tool. It's the new language that was supposed to be added.
So you're not seeing it yet in the survey tool? We still have that step to go, yeah?
No, it's not in the survey tool. I only filed a ticket.
Okay, well then maybe, please share that ticket. Maybe there was a problem with the core data, and I don't know. Without looking at the ticket, I don't want to speculate. But maybe there was a problem in getting it into the survey data. Maybe we certainly can unblock that and get that to the survey tool and get you started with that better interface so you can add a lot more data.
Was this Bobola?
Yes, sir.
I remember Rogers, you contacted me about this. I don't see Obolo or Obolo in the survey tool. It has a code ANN.
ANN?
Yes.
Okay. Let me look at that. Rogers, if you can, in the chat.
Can I drop? Okay.
Do we
Rogers,
have Roger's email?
Yeah. Well, he's got, Rogers, you've got my email, craig@unicode.org. And I work with this CLDR team, and somebody can follow up with you, and we can get things working.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yes, Roger, the connection was very difficult for us to deal with, but we will deal with it offline. Please send an email to Craig, and we'll take it from there and we'll help you. And you can also include me, Jeanette, at translationcommons.org, so we can all help you. And Craig Cornelius, you're in touch, yes.
Thank you.
Next one is Julie.
Julie?
Thank you. Yes, a quick follow-up question. So I think this is a little different from what Rogers was asking. That is, okay, so if I'm a language advocate, I open a JIRA account, I file a ticket, I start to put in my language data. At what point is that language data visible just to the public? Is it immediately available to the public? Or is there some later phase where I make it available to the public?
So the survey tool is public. The JIRA system, as you notice, is limited to only those users who logged in, but you know anybody can create a login.
And so the language data, the days of the week, whatever I'm putting in there,
it's public.
It's public. Thank you.
Yes. It's public through survey tool, yes.
Thank you.
And so there are things that, you know, certain language communities may not necessarily wish to share publicly, but most of the time, the data for CLDR those are not things that need to have greater security or cannot be shared. So most of the things in CLDR are things that are pieces of data that are known or can be shared. But we have to be respectable of different communities and their needs. So, you know, in certain times, they may not share any. They may not share. Some pieces may not be able to be shared, and that may prevent us from getting the language working as well as on the devices as we like. But it sort of has to be on a case by case basis, and most of the time, that's not a problem.
Sure, I would imagine that's true, and I'm just thinking maybe in some cases if people are needing to coin words and wanting to be sure that they've got approval from whoever they, you know, an agreement and so forth, whatever. But yeah, I would imagine that most of it is not that sensitive.
Yeah.
Craig Cornelius?
Dr. Craig?
I hate to do this, but I want to make sure that people understand that once data is in CLDR, there is no guarantee that it's going to appear on one's mobile device or user interfaces anytime soon. It is not a requirement that every vendor builds that into every operating system.
That's a very good point, Craig. Thank you. I will add to that the opposite is true, and that is if the data is not in CLDR, it's almost assuredly, the language is almost assuredly not going to be on the device.
Any more comments, questions? Tex.
So this is not a question for Craig, but for the audience. As you know, for Translation Commons, we're looking at expanding our teams that are working on fonts and keyboards, terminology, CLDR, and the like. And so for those of you that are professors or working with universities, I would like to ask whether you might be aware of some of your students, or just more generally people. So let's take, for example, in specifically fonts. Do you have people in the language community that also have perhaps design skills and could work on fonts? And we would like to bring them into the fold, as it were, and see if we can then further train them or engage them in creating fonts for languages. And they could be languages, native to your country, or maybe more generally. And then, of course, not just fonts, but if you have some students with programming skills, might be interested in keyboards, or the other aspects of digitization of languages, we would like to work with them and see if we can't build up the expertise to bring languages to being digital, and maybe also engage them in training other people. We'll train them and try and take it forward. So if you could reach out, if you're aware of students or individuals in your communities that might like to get involved, we would welcome their contacting us and seeing how we can engage them. So thank you, Craig. Great talk. I didn't mean to distract from that, which is why I waited till the end. But it's something.
Actually, Tex, go ahead, please.
No, that was it. Unless you want to hear a longer appeal.
No, I'm gonna actually add to the appeal, and that is you've heard me talk about limited resources. Right now, the system works really well for a few languages. If we want to get to the many tens or hundreds or thousands that we need to in the decade, we are going to need more resources, from fonts and keyboards to data entry to a number of these pieces, engagement with the communities, and there's opportunity abounds here for a lot of people, and a lot of people are going to have to step up. And never before has, I think, there been a more enthusiastic project to work on. But that's my personal opinion. But hopefully that excites enough people to get involved, from the linguists to the techies, to help make this work better, because at some point we're going to be overwhelmed, and we're stretching resources as it is right now. So,
and there's also a bit of an opportunity here if we train some of the people in your community at your university, then you have the opportunity to then create classes within your university to offer them to your other students and people who are interested. So at some point, the language portion of your university could be saying, all right, we now have courses in font design for language, for different languages, or just generally the same thing for just the different aspects of language digitization. So by coming to work with us, it could actually be an opportunity for the university, as well as a good career move, since language digitization is something that is going to go on for years. So creating expertise in that area, and being able to train others with those skills will benefit your students.
Sue Ellen has raised her hand.
Yeah, it's a wonderful vision, but it ain't going to happen. Creating courses is not the way to go, because that is a huge undertaking, and you've got set curricula and all kinds of things. But what really can happen is to seek out talented young scholars looking for master's topics or PhD topics who want to do research in a specific area and train that person and get them in contact with the right people to further their work would be a really creative way to bring new scholars and new talent into the project. So it's with individuals that you can, and you can certainly, if I were still teaching, but I'm not, include little pieces in lectures that inspire students to come to you and say, I think I'd be interested in working on this in a project. That's the kind of thing that can happen that would bring in some people in, as opposed to trying to create a course where you could certainly do workshops where you'd say, let's talk about font design. Who wants to talk about fonts and this? We'll do a workshop. That kind of thing.
And I would add, Sue Ellen, that scholars would be great, but not everybody has to be a scholar. Some people may have done the scholarly thing. Some people may just have the right skills or the expertise that need to help the process, and it's valuable to the process, and it's valuable. Those skills are valuable to themselves, and as Tech said, it looks really good on a resume.
Yeah, well, and you might have a student in computer science or in anthropology who comes from a certain background, who is not necessarily involved in a linguistics department, who would be inspired to do something like this because of their personal background.
I'd like to hear from some of the professors, and I appreciate your comments, Sue Ellen, but there are corporations who are looking for people with some of these skills in order to be able to expand, and a university working with some of that portion of the industry would benefit from being able to offer a class to help.
You have no idea what it takes to get a class off the ground.
Yeah, I understand the difficulty of creating a class, but anyway, we don't have to debate it.
Yes,
and what I'd like to do is hear from people in the university community, see what works for them.
Siva has his hand up.
Yeah, mine is a very naive question because I'm an anthropologist. I'm not so well trained in. I've read linguistics, but as a part of linguistic anthropology. But it was a wonderful lecture, but I could get a lot of things. Partly, it takes time for me also to sink in. But what you mentioned sometime in one of the things, that there are certain concepts or certain ideas which may not have equivalent or any other meanings. When we don't have such kind of things, how do we digitize those ideas or those concepts? Whether it is CLDR or any other form. It's a very naive question. I don't know how whether I'm clear to you.
You're clear to me, Siva. And it's a great question. And so for others, the question is for pieces of data where there isn't a concept necessarily in the culture or the language, how were you able to express that culture that in CLDR data to computers in such a way that it can be used, or would that necessarily be limiting if you cannot express it? Would it be limiting in getting your language on computers? The latter is certainly not true, and I'm going to lean on Dr. Craig Cornelius in just a moment, but let me make a comment. And Dr. Craig Cornelius has a great story about Cherokee and them coming up with words for email. With other communities, there have been, like the Muskogee community doesn't have a word for seconds, and we're still working on that. Maybe we'll come up with a word. Maybe it won't. That the lack of seconds may make it a little more challenging for some of the time formatting and time pieces to work. And time's a pretty critical thing to computers and mobile devices. Not to mention, I have this day job that gets in the way of my Unicode fun. It's called Amazon, and we use dates and times a lot. Like, when's my package arriving? Tomorrow? Yesterday? It would have been nice. And so, those concepts are important and may need to be addressed. And working with the language community, I believe some of that can be done. In other cases, but I have never seen the case where it prevents your language from being on the device. The decisions there are typically something other than, oh, you were missing the CLDR piece for a second. Sorry, you can't be on a device. That will not hold Muskogee back. So for what that's worth, Siva. And then I think Craig should tell his, if there's time, I don't want to take away from other people. It'd be great to hear from some other professors, but Craig Cornelius has a great story about Cherokee and the word for email. One more thing. So, for example, another example I have of data missing, or that the system doesn't cater as well to certain concepts for the language. So it turns out that many of the indigenous communities I've worked with so far, they don't have 12 months. They have 13 months. They have a lunar calendar. Well, it turns out the computers actually support lunar calendars and can do that right now, but it's another one of these pieces that's not turned on right at the moment. So there's still some computer work. If you've got tech-savvy computer scientists that would like to write that code, there's a little code that needs to be written to make that work, but we can make that work. And there are some communities that only recognize 4 seasons. They don't have 12 months. And so all of this can work. There are ways to get the computers where it doesn't work now. It can be made to work better. But again, we need the people to write the code. We need the people to contribute the data. We need the language community to work, to engage, and we need people to engage with the language community. So there's some work to do.
Yeah, my other contention is, but because we are looking at these ideas from a particular maybe a language background, or say for example, if it is in English or German or Spanish, or in India it's Hindi and other kind of dominant languages. When we are trying to look at the concepts, we are looking at them from these language perspectives. So then what happens is we do not find, because for example, I use certain words in my language, they just simply cannot be translated because the concepts are not there in that other language. So that is the kind of a challenge I think I'm trying to put a question in that format actually.
It's a great challenge. The good news is CLDR is so limited that there aren't that many of those in CLDR, but it could happen. And I'd like to think there's a way through both the language and the technology to overcome those. And I have not found a case where we've not been able to overcome that yet. But there may be. I'm not going to let that stop me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Siva. Maybe you can also mention in your meetings for multilingualism for other people, for other countries, yes, that we're looking for, this type of skill sets to help us with the decade starting. We will have the opportunity.
No, I think I will try and forward an email address. Recently, one of the, in fact, in my session she has presented, I was coordinating that session, and she is some Professor Chelea, and she teaches in US and has been working on different languages, and she is in the area of translations. I will forward that link, and I will also write to her that she should, because she's excellent. She gave a wonderful talk, and I'll try and pull some resources of that and then inform you, and as also I'll circulate.
Thank you.
Others. I'll do that.
Thank you very much, Siva. So if we don't have any other questions, we reached our 1.5 hour allocated. So I don't want to take too much from your schedule. Craig Cummings, it was a wonderful presentation. And thank you everybody for a wonderful conversation and discussion where a lot of things are said to clarify even more and to help communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye everyone. Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.